Welcome back, everyone, to Random's Thoughts. We're coming to you today with another Runestrike video, this time a deck breakdown. So let's say you're a new player to this game, that you're just learning the ropes, but you know for sure, you are positive that you just want to absolutely kick your opponent's teeth in, hit them hard, hit them fast. Well, I may have something in store for you today. We're going to be talking about Ogma, which is a Chaos Nature aggressive build that carried me to my first diamond placement, or the highest rank right now in Runestrike. So let's jump into it. Where do we begin? Well, let's start with the champion himself. Ogma is, as mentioned, a nature, chaos, aggressively oriented champion. With a primal roar, he bashes the heads of his enemies, drawing blood for his cause. Pretty dramatic, but Ogma is pretty dramatic in that from the word go until the game closes, either way, he is out for blood right off the bat. So if you're into that sort of deck style, then you're going to love this. You're going to love playing this champion. Let's talk a little bit about his abilities. So his A1 is Battle Frenzy. Target minion gets +2/+2 and Trample. This is obviously the one you start out with when you pick up Ogma, and it's put in a lot of work for me from the PvE elements of the game through the PvP elements. It's not that hard to see that, look, this will make your guys bigger, stronger, and they can push damage. It gives you a little bit of reach due to Trample, even on smaller minions that wouldn't ordinarily get through. They would just get blocked and stuffed by any blocker. In this particular case, though, once they have Trample, they're able to eke out, 1 damage here, 2 damage there, where they wouldn't ordinarily be able to do so, and it definitely adds up over the course of the game. Now, next is Savage Shout, where until end of your turn, target friendly minion gains attack equal to your attack. My build does not feature any champion attack buffing abilities, but you can definitely pour it on with this one. And at a only meager cost of 2 blood, you can build up the blood and then just pour it on, especially on speed minions. And that's where if your opponent ever blinks, you can close the gap very quickly, either to close the game out or just put yourself at such an enormous lead, creating a gap that it may be difficult for your opponent to recover. Now, the last ability, Seismic Rage, I actually don't have unlocked yet, which may tell you a little bit about how strong this build can be, even though you don't have access to all of the abilities. But at a 4-cost blood ability, your minions gain +1/+1 and Frenzy attack again. Obviously, if you can set up a board, you could really pummel someone who is unable to really muster defenses. It's entirely possible that this one's really win more. The first two have been more than sufficient, and the matchups where you are losing, it doesn't appear that Seismic Rage would have really turned the tables. Were there games that could have been won if I had access to Seismic Rage that I lost because I did not? I'm sure there were, but for the most part, you're going to be pouring the blood into Battle Frenzy and Savage Shout. So now that we talked a little bit about the champion, let's dive into the build. So here's the full deck list. You can see down in the corner that's a little obscured, and we'll start there first just to get it out of the way. We'll go high to low. We're looking at Trample Herd. Now, one thing to preface the entire discussion for this is that there are a lot of budget options that you could substitute in for, whether it's legendaries, it's epics, it's rares, it's whatever, so that you can build this sort of strategy. The deck is very aptly named for me, Blitz, because that was very much what I was leaning into. It's an aggressive build, Blitz, and I've said this on stream many times, I've said this in other mediums, that in any game where you have the ability to direct your attacks at your opponent's minions, Blitz ends up being the best keyword because it just gives you so much flexibility. In addition, it produces a body. So you really get the best of all worlds when you have that keyword. But we'll get there momentarily. Like I said, just a slight digression about the fact that you can substitute things in that will definitely carry you. And I only added some of these higher essence cost cards, the legendaries, some of the epics, much later in my final push to diamond. It's entirely possible you could make it there without even having these things. I just wanted to include more cool stuff. So let's talk about Trample Herd. At 8 cost, you would normally think that this is not an aggressive deck card, but if you're familiar with the card Mastodon, this card summons a Mastodon to each of your empty slots and you give them Trample. Now, Mastodon, we'll look at it real quick, is a 2/3 with Blitz. So you have a lane filler, fills all your lanes that are available anyway, with blitzing Trample minions. Now, we already talked about Trample a little bit, but you could, of course, buff these after the fact. Now, whether that means that you're able to clear out a pesky opposing minion, or you're just pushing face damage, you are representing a lot of potential threats here. And it allows you also simultaneously to recover from opposing sweepers, which is something that I'll come back to shortly. But you do have to keep in mind when playing any aggressive deck, Ogma included, what the opposing board clears that your opponent has access to. It could be Arcane Overload. It could be Bright Song. It could be a number of other cards. You just have to dance and balance around their removal and what options they have available, all the while just weighing whether you need to just close the game out and go for the throat. Sometimes if you hem and haw too much and you allow your opponent to last, they will find those removal cards instead of just pushing for the end of the game, trying to hit the finish line and close it out. So Trample Herd allows you to recover from one of those things, or, as mentioned, close the game out when you don't want to give your opponent the opportunity to try and recover. So next we're going to talk about Longship Raid, which functions in a very similar circumstance. You don't get quite as many things, they aren't quite as big, but you get 3 Viking Raiders added to your hand and they cost 0 as a 7 cost spell. So essentially you can plop those Vikings out immediately. Now what are the Vikings? Well, they happen to be in the deck as well. These are 3 cost 2/2s with Blitz and Frenzy. Add a copy of a random rune from your enemy's deck to the bottom of your deck. Now, realistically, you don't care about the Frenzy. The Frenzy really is never going to come into play because the game will be decided one way or the other long before this happens. It's entirely possible that your opponent ends up drawing through their whole deck before the game ends, and they're drawing from their void. However, you're probably not going to do that. You will either have crushed your enemies and seen them driven before you, or been crushed yourself. It's one of the two. But Longship Raid, all of the things that apply to Trample Herd, well, guess what? They also come up with Longship Raid. It allows you to remove things. It allows you to recover. It allows you to try and close the game out. Personally, in both instances, I prefer to hold on to them as a follow-up. You can overcommit with your other minions and then just go, oh, you wipe my board? All right, I'll Longship Raid. I have a new board. Get in there. Or, oh, you wipe my board. I'll Trample Herd and let's just end this right now. Either way, you have late game options that, again, although it's an aggressive deck and it seems weird if you've come from other games to have things this high cost, these are super powerful cards. These present enormous threats, have enormous potential, and you can do a lot of mean things to your opponent with them. So continuing down, we're going to talk about another card that seems somewhat out of place, and that's Twister. It's a 6 cost spell that deals 4 damage to all enemy minions. Enemy minions with flight are also stunned. Again, it seems weird to have a board clear in this sort of deck, but the fact of the matter is that it is not impossible for your opponent to end up generating a very sticky board if they're undead. One that, even if you clear the minions out, they're still blockers. Or they just happen to flood the board with a bunch of opposing minions. Or you're playing the mirror and you need to clear a path. You need to buy a turn against a flyer that happens to be a big threat that can actually race you. You need to, the list goes on and on and on. You get the idea. Point is that due to the small deck size in Runestrike, it's very easy to end up finding one of these cards and then just sitting on it until that perfect moment. Your opponent has overextended just enough to say, all right, if I can survive one turn, I can turn the tide against Ogma. And guess what? You go, bam, Twister, wipe your board, get in there, end the game. And that's what ends up happening in more cases than you think. There's a lot of scenarios and a lot of games that I played with this deck that it just so happens that, all right, well, Twister is the only thing that gets me out of here. And then top deck Twister, turn a game that was unwinnable into a game that is unlosable because you just clear your opponent's board. Long term, I could see this leaving the deck if we get better aggressive options, because ideally, you'd rather have something that, does face damage. But it effectively does face damage by clearing a path, and if you look at it in that context, then Twister makes a lot of sense here in this build. So from there, we're going to go to a card that was added very late for me in this build's lifespan, which kind of makes it sound like I'm putting it aside, but I'm not, but digression aside. That's Tauric Warleader. It's a 5/5 for 6 with a war cry. This gains Blitz if another friendly warrior is in play, but it also has Strike. Other friendly minions gain +1 attack until the end of your turn. All parts of this card are pretty nuts. I really wanted to include it because I kept pulling it off of a certain 2-drop that we'll get to later on. It happens to be a Beast Warrior itself, which is why it was appearing off of that 2-drop. But it naturally has the potential, at least, to have what I call the most powerful keyword, and that's Blitz. This thing could attack right away. It's a 5/5. It represents a bunch of damage. It could also, again, run into something and just kill it. But wait, there's more. It also buffs your team, which can present, obviously, a whole bunch of face damage. It clears blockers. It does all these things that we keep repeating, and you'll notice the broken record kind of go through. It's not that hard, actually, to set up a scenario where you have another warrior, as long as your opponent isn't just wiping your board every single turn. There are a surprisingly high number of warriors in this, and oh, by the way, they can also be produced off of some of your spells, such as Longship Raid, which we'll talk about in a little while when we get back to Viking Raider, note the warrior. So as said, there's a number of different ways for, excuse me, that Tauric Warleader can be really strong, and I really like this card. Now, it actually took the slot of another card that I really, really liked, and I'd love to include more copies of. And there are parts of this list that are kind of in flux, and Mindless Raider is one of them. It's a 4/5 for 6 with Blitz. Now, normally aggressive cards, you want higher attack than cost. That's kind of just a general rule, not a hard and fast one, obviously. But Blitz is just such a powerful keyword. This is such a significant body on a Blitz character that it kind of overrides everything. Now, unfortunately, it's a rogue, not a warrior, so we don't have the extra added Tauric Warleader synergy. But being a 4/5 means that it survives a whole lot of removal, or could survive a whole lot of removal. It could run into something and survive if your opponent plays their own, say, Sicklestalker. Spoiler, we're going to get there momentarily. It also represents face damage. So, again, the versatility of the keyword Blitz is incredible, and Mindless Raider is no exception. So speaking of Blitz and versatility, let's talk about Sicklestalker. It's a 4/1 for 4 with Blitz. Not a whole lot of card text compared to some of the other things that we've looked at, but similar to Mindless Raider, we're again getting all of the versatility that Blitz provides, but for 1 mana less, well, 2 mana less than Mindless Raider. Yes, you lose 4 health, but realistically, you don't care. This thing is either getting in and killing something in most cases, or getting in and killing your opponent, so I guess kind of more of the same. It allows you to just pressure constantly. And again, after board clears, after removal, you can present a follow-up board that immediately, it's like nothing ever happened. Oh, you wipe my board, and it's late in the game. All right, well, I'll play Mindless Raider and Sicklestalker. Get in for 8. Now you have to clear my board again. And if you don't have your own Blitz, if you don't have your own out-of-hand removal, you're just blocking it, in which case then maybe I'm using A1 or A2 from Ogma's abilities and then just buffing them up and either pushing additional damage or trampling over your guy or simply just eating it, even if I'm not pushing extra damage. You have a lot of flexibility between the powers and Blitz. It just gives you so many options. So next we're going to talk about another removal card. I do believe that it's worth running removal in aggro, just as, again, a general rule. It obviously varies on the game and the particular build and the curve and all these other details that go into deck building. But Feast or Famine here was originally Pillar of Flame. It could be Consume, it could be Annihilate, it could be a number of different removal cards that are kind of just to taste. Now this is, I'm going to say, quote-unquote, strictly better. It's not, I'm sure there's a scenario that makes strictly better not accurate. However, you have Feast or Famine, which is the modality of this card is when you play it on something, you can choose to either give something 5 health or they lose 5 health, which is relevant because it's not damaged. So it can go through shields, it can evade a number of other different effects, such as Protected. It also is 1 more than Pillar of Flame, which, as correctly pointed out by chat on my live Twitch stream, Pillar of Flame, because we don't feature anything to buff our attack, is only ever going to do 4. Well, this does 5. So we'll go with the bigger number. I'm sure there are going to be edge case scenarios where Feast will come into play as well. It hasn't yet, but I think we can all imagine things. So Feast or Famine is definitely relevant in order to remove things. Again, keep in mind that being able to go through shields, being able to evade damage prevention effects is key. And I'm confident I'm going to forget about it. But we'll move on. So let's talk about what could quite possibly be my favorite card in the entire deck. There are an enormous number of games that I ended by playing 1 or 2 of these late in the game. Sometimes even early in the game. A turn 4 Desperate Charge, if your opponent has not really contested your early board, and you have a couple speed minions out, it's not going to look good for them. It's going to look real bad, real fast. Especially, as I said, if you're able to play multiples of these. Again, being an aggressive deck, you don't care about the back end, the health, the butt on your minions, for the most part. It'll come up occasionally, don't get me wrong. But for the most part, you don't care. They get in, they do their thing, and they almost may as well be spells. You're just trying to push damage. You need to end the game before bad things start happening to you. Now, Desperate Charge is a 4 cost until end of turn, the end of your turn. Your minions get +4 attack. At the end of your turn, reduce their health to 1. Now, there's a number of different things to consider here and unpack. We'll start at the bottom by reducing their health to 1. So that means that they keep their health for the beginning part of the turn, the pre-combat phase, which is relevant for a number of different effects. It could be that there are on attack effects such as Suffer. When you hit your attack step, they'll lose health, but it doesn't matter because you had 3, so you suffer 2, you still live. That sort of thing. It also matters when you play some of your self-damaging effects, so that way you still have more than 1 health. You can self-damage to get a buff and then continue pushing. All of these come into play, but obviously the top half of the card is the more important one. 4 attack is enormous, especially when you do things such as play a Trample Herd and then follow up the next turn with Desperate Charge. Or you happen to just have an existing board, you play another Blitz minion, and then you Desperate Charge. Or your opponent okay, they couldn't block 2 things. Desperate Charge twice, oops, you're dead. You can just push an enormous amount of damage, especially with speed minions. It can just be bonkers. Desperate Charge is one of my favorite cards, and it felt awesome basically every time you played it. In some rare scenarios, you could even use it as quote-unquote removal so that you can end up clearing out opposing blockers. And it's really, you're obviously not going to be excited about that, but again, flexibility of the different cards. Again, you don't really care that much about your minion's health because if they're clearing out the blocker and your opponent, again, does not have Blitz or out-of-hand removal, they just have to block it again, which means you'll get first act based on the way that the combat in Runestrike works. So there's a lot of different ways that Desperate Charge and all the other cards in this can put you ahead. So now we'll come back to Viking Raider. What can we say that wasn't already said? Well, I'll be honest, these are some of the weaker cards in the deck. It is obviously, quote-unquote, worse than Mastodon. Again, the Frenzy is virtually irrelevant. It's just lower health. It doesn't really matter. It is a warrior, though, so the synergy with Tauric Warleader is there. The requirement for Tauric Warleader is there. If we had no warriors, obviously, Tauric Warleader would be, well, significantly worse. So that's the main thing. You do want to try and utilize these as appropriate. Generally going face, it's only a matter of, do you feel you need to clear out the lane so that way when your opponent plays the inevitable board clear, because they're going to have it, they're going to have removal for your stuff, do you have enough lanes free or did you leave blockers? And that is often the tension between trying to push face damage versus fight your opponent's stuff. And sometimes it is appropriate that, the 2 damage doesn't matter right now and may not matter long term. It's better to free up that lane so that way your opponent doesn't end up building up a substantial board. Moving from there, we'll talk about Mastodon again. We're kind of getting into broken record territory, going in circles territory, where Mastodon, keyword Blitz, that's basically the only thing that matters here. Obviously, if it didn't have that, we wouldn't be playing it. I am hard-pressed to think of any other way that we would without it having like a humongous stat redistribution or something like that. Just being Blitz is good enough. So from there, we're going to talk about a card that I alluded to earlier, and that's Swamp Scout. It's a 2/1 Amazon Warrior for 2. And Warcry is Conjure a Random Beast. So this is how I was getting Tauric Warleaders before I actually was able to craft the card. Tauric Warleader feels great off of this, especially late in the game, because say turn 8, you play this, and then you play Tauric Warleader and get in, and suddenly your board is much more threatening than your opponent thought it would be. But one of the important things about this is it lowers the curve. It front loads things, so you have a decent 2-drop. Yeah, a 2/1 for 2 is not super thrilling. Let's not go overboard and overstate what's there. But one that replaces itself, and because of the selection that you're presented when you conjure something, it allows you to adapt. Do I need to fill a hole in my curve? Do I just need more late game? Do I need more early game? Do I need this? Do I need that? Well, guess what? You're going to have a slew of options, 3 in particular, but you're allowed to then mold and modify exactly how the game is going to shape out based on what you're hitting off the scout. So it's great early, it's great late. I really love Swamp Scout. I think this card is fantastic. Now, another late addition to the deck is Spirit Falcon. This is one of the cards that I spoke about earlier and said that you can certainly move to a more budget option. In my opinion, you will definitely be taking a downgrade here, and obviously that's true across the board. There's a reason that you want these cards and not the other ones in the default case. One of the options that you can replace this with is Furies, but here's the reason why it is a weaker option than Spirit Falcon. It's the 2 on the back end. Spirit Falcon is a 1/2 for 2 with evade, flight, and speed. Now, the evade is definitely important, but realistically for me and what I found in a number of games is that there's a lot of effects that do 3. You have a variety of champion powers as well as spells and even attackers that will push 3 damage. And the problem with Furies is that, well, even buffed with Ogma's A1, you're going to end up running into the problem that, hey, this only has 3 health. I could die. I've invested a card and 3 blood into buffing this threat, and then my opponent just removes it with their A1. That's not really a trade you want to make. Comparatively, Spirit Falcon, I mean, it has the evade to ensure that it's not necessarily going to die to an out-of-hand, say, opposing Sicklestalker, at least not initially, but it also has the bigger back end, so you could play it, immediately buff it, and then it's going to require additional help or higher end, and when I say higher end, generally like 4 costs and above removal cards, meaning that it could get in for that 6 damage when it's buff, and then you're in a great place and pushing with a great start. It also, of course, has evasion, but really, in most cases, and we're going to talk about this when we get to the next card as well, I've found the flight to be a drawback because you want to be able to interact to some extent with your opponent's board. When they play a blocker, you want to be able to clear it so that you can keep pushing. While I said earlier that a lot of your minions are simply burn spells, you'd prefer they not be. And similarly, I also said earlier when we were talking about Desperate Charge that you don't care about the health on your minions, which is true for the most part, but you want to get the maximum value out of all these things. So you do have to care about both those things sometimes. Here's where a lot of it comes up. Again, trying to dodge the 3 damage removals, as well as if you could interact with blockers, again, maybe not again, but non-flying blockers in this case, you could clear that out and then continue pushing damage. Sometimes you'd rather have the evasion, but I found most of the time it's your opponent is desperately trying to just stave off your onslaught. So if you can clear a path faster, that's better than just punching and they'll get the Falcon. Now, since it has evade, you're likely to get multiple attacks in anyway, hopefully. But it has been a liability. Really, the last keyword, and I'm going to talk about this again when we move to the next card, but speed is spectacular. Getting 2 attacks cannot be understated. Is it the best keyword in the game? No, I still am of the opinion that Blitz is that, but speed is really, really good, and it scales incredibly. You have Tauric Warleaders, you have your champion abilities, you have Desperate Charge. There are a number of different ways to buff any of your speed minions, and all of a sudden they go from, well, I was going to say 0 to 60, but 1 to a gajillion. and then just absolutely thrash your opponent out of nowhere. You can put yourself at an enormous life lead, which is something that I don't know how many people think about this when they're playing Runestrike, but if you are at a large life lead, you just have a lot more to play with than you would in other games because you're presenting a constant clock with your champion punching your opponent. The fact of the matter is that if you get out to a life lead and your opponent doesn't do anything, they're obviously going to do something, but if they just do nothing, you'll win by virtue of your champion just punching them. That's not necessarily true in other games where your opponent could end up being at one life for a long time, stabilize, and then turn the game around. That's not to say that that can't happen in Runestrike, but having that enormous life lead shortens the clock on what your opponent can do. And getting out to an early lead via buffed up Spirit Falcons that your opponent just has to desperately try and deal with can be a very big deal. So we'll move on from Spirit Falcon. We'll talk about Blade Dancer, who is one of the premier cards for the deck. All of the things I said about Spirit Falcon now apply here, but it's ground-based, so you're going to deal with and be able to interact with opposing blockers more readily than Spirit Falcon. Again, there are pros and cons to that. It's an aggressive deck. You do want to be pushing damage. Evasion typically sounds great, but the problem, of course, is, as mentioned, that if your opponent is able to just eat your guy without effort, because you can't interact with them, you may not be pushing as much damage as you like. But similar to Swamp Scout and Spirit Falcon, this only costs 2, which is important because, again, it lowers the curve. We talked at the beginning about all of the cards that are super high cost in this deck. The Longship Raids, the Trample Herds, even Tauric Warleader and Twister are up there, Mindless Raider. These things the 7 and 8 cost probably would never be run in other games due to the game would just be over before then. The 6 cost would be pushing it, but depending on their abilities could be played just by virtue of the cost we're talking about. Obviously, the text impacts things. You would be more front-loaded, but here in Runestrike, it's a little bit different. The life totals are larger. The combat works differently. There are a lot of unique angles that change the way things play out. Blade Dancer is going to be, you just want to find them, and you're mulliganing for these pretty much in every case so that you can find them, and then the turn you play them, ideally immediately slam A1 on it so that way it's larger. That's been my game plan. As we play more games, maybe that will change. The last card we're going to talk about is Rampage. Rampage fits into the category, as many other cards do in this deck, where it just has an enormous amount of flexibility. So one thing I'll call out immediately is, remember when we were talking about Desperate Charge and it reduces health to 1 at end of turn? Well, Rampage is what I was alluding to when I said it impacts the ability to play other cards. But let's talk about the flexibility for a moment first. The flexibility comes in because you can deal the damage to your opponent's cards, similar to all the Blitz minions and a number of other cards in this deck. I mean, we're talking Longship Raid and Trample Herd, so it's kind of creating Blitz minions anyway. But the point is that these cards all provide options to you as the player, which is something that may sound like a foreign concept to people who tend to beat up on aggro and say that there's not any skill involved. First of all, that's not true. Aggro definitely takes skill and is on par with other deck archetypes, whether it's control, it's mid-range, it's combo, it's aggro control, it's pick something else. It doesn't really matter. It all depends on the cards, the format, and the game in question. The specific scenarios, yes, a particular deck could be, quote-unquote, easy to pilot, but that doesn't mean that it, A, actually is, just because general opinion is that, or B, that it's generally true of a given archetype. Aggro definitely requires skill, and the fact that you have all of these flexible cards such as Rampage kind of reinforces that. Rampage could be removal, it could be a buff, it can do various combat tricks, it allows you to do a lot of different things, but of course you could just play it on one of your speed minions and then just absolutely thrash your opponent, just annihilate them, just slap them around because you go Savage Shout, Rampage, Desperate Charge, load something up, get in there for 1 billion. Sometimes it happens, and it's fun. It feels great. So Rampage gives you a number of different ways that you can take down your opponent and score wins with Ogma. So that's the deck as it is right now. There are a number of different things that could be changed, could be tweaked, whether it's due to your budget, it's due to your preference. But in general, I would recommend, well, you want as many Blitz minions as you can. You want to try and ensure that your curve is as appropriate as possible so that you are hitting things early. You're not, to me, really going to be able to contest the later game decks all that well in the late game unless you drastically change the build. And there are certainly other ways to build Ogma. But let's jump into the final thoughts for the build. We already started going over a few of the final thoughts for this, but Ogma for me is definitely a lot of fun. It presents exactly how I want to start out when I start out playing games. I want to play the aggressive decks. I want to learn what cards I need to fear and respect, namely the sweepers, the removal, how the combat works, how certain things interact. It helps me personally learn the game. And then I continue to play them because I just enjoy the aggressive builds. They're a lot of fun to play. They let you do some powerful things. And again, beating the dead horse, broken record time. There's a lot of flexibility in the cards here based on the blitz mechanic as well as the modality of certain cards. There's a number of decision points to be made, but at the end of the day, if you want to, you know what? Just load something up and go face. If you're looking for more Runestrike content, definitely hit the follow button down there. I appreciate everybody for hanging out and listening to this breakdown. As always, everybody, thank you for listening, thank you for watching, and Black Lives Matter.